and welcome to the latest episode of KRAD COVID Readings. I'm Keith R.A. DeCandido, and on this Thanksgiving week, I am doing a three-part reading of my novella, Enterprises of Great Pitch and Moment, which was a crossover between Star Trek The Next Generation and Star Trek Deep Space Nine. Before we start, I want to mention once again my Patreon, which has lots of really cool things on it. There are TV reviews, anywhere between 1 and 5 per month, as a general rule, but lots of them anyway. Which you can get for $5 a month. Also, at that same level, you can get cat pictures, which I post not quite daily, but often. I have very picturesque and cute cats. For $1 a month, you get a movie review every month. For $7 a month, you also get excerpts from my work in progress, whatever that might be that week. And for $10 a month, you get vignettes featuring my original characters from the Precinct series, from the Cassie Zukov series, from the Bram Gold series, from the Shirley Holmes and Jack Watson series, and from the Super City Cops series. There's going to be a new one of those this week, hopefully, if all goes well. And then for $20 a month, you get all that, plus you get first looks at my first drafts. So anytime I finish a chapter of a novel or I finish a short story, you get to see that raw, unedited first draft. So please consider checking it out. Like I said, the most expensive thing is $20 a month. And all the way down, anywhere, it can be $1 a month, $2 a month, $5, $10, $5, $7, or $10 a month if you don't want to do as much as $20. It's cheap at half the price, cheap at twice the price, and it's got some really cool stuff, and it'll help me pay some bills too. So everybody wins. Anyway, moving on. We now continue with part 2 of this crossover between Next Generation and Deep Space Nine, which takes place just before the movie First Contact. It takes place not too long before the episode Rapture of Deep Space Nine. Between the Ascent and Rapture, actually, those two episodes. And also after the previous 5 installments of the Next Generation novella miniseries Slings and Arrows, of which this was the concluding part, which chronicled the year leading up to Star Trek First Contact. So, anyhow. Chapter 5. Runabout Zambesi, on the periphery of the Badlands. The trip to the Badlands went into the sleep cycles of both captains. Thanks to DS9 keeping Bajoran time with their 26-hour day, those cycles were several hours off from each other, so both captains were able to get a full 8 hours sleep. It also spared Sisko the need to hold a conversation with Jean-Luc Picard. It was fine as long as they were discussing duty-related things, but being in a runabout with him for so long, Sisko had no idea what to even say to the man. Leaving aside his reputation in Starfleet, there was always locutus between them. Every time he looked at Picard's face, he saw Jennifer's killer. Once both men had slept their fill, however, there was no way to avoid it. Picard ordered some Earl Grey tea from the replicator. Sisko had already procured a Ractigino. As he took the co-pilot's seat, Picard said, "I take it there's no wood." Shaking his head, Sisko said, "Not yet. Worf contacted us half an hour ago with nothing to report. Oh, and your Mr. Data also called in with a similar report." Picard smiled. Both Data and Worf are quite the sticklers for regulations. "So I've noticed." Sisko hesitated, then said, "He and O'Brien have both been invaluable to the station." "I'm not surprised. I'd always considered them, both of them, to be among my most reliable officers." Sisko found he had nothing to add to that and sipped from his Ractigino cup. After several seconds, Picard said, "I was hoping to get the chance to see the aqueduct before we leave." Frowning, Sisko said, "I'm sorry?" "Shortly after you took over, the Enterprise D came to the station to help install an aqueduct." "Right." Sisko had, in fact, completely forgotten that the Enterprise had been involved in that project, and wondered what that said about his lingering feelings about Picard. Probably the same thing that not wanting to talk to him says. It's working quite well, actually. The farms in the Lotha province are almost back at the levels they were before the Cardassians created that mine. Grand. Another pause. "You've done fine work here, Captain. I'm pleased that you stuck with the assignment." "So am I," Sisko said, and this he could say with conviction. "I was, however, surprised to learn that you become a figure in the Bajorans' religion." Now Sisko tensed. "I'm simply the person who discovered the Celestial Temple, Captain, and I've already had the Cultural Contamination lecture from Starfleet Command." "No intention of lecturing you," Picard said snappishly. "However, I do have a certain amount of experience in these matters." That caught Sisko off guard. "What do you mean?" Picard hesitated. "Several years ago, on Mintaka 3, I was worshipped as a god. Apparently I had fulfilled the prophecy of theirs. It was purely circumstance, but the Mintakans mistook our technology for divinity. It took a great deal of effort to convince them that I was not their god. He took a sip of his tea. This is not to say that you should do likewise. I simply wish to say that I'm aware of the burden you carry. It's no burden, Sisko said, and he surprised himself with the words. I admit I wasn't very comfortable with the way so many Bajorans treated me at first, but the Bajorans... He smiled. They have a way of getting to you. Picard nodded. They do rather, don't they? You told me when I took this assignment that Bajor meant a great deal to you. I'd say after 4 years they mean at least as much to me. If that means they call me Emissary and hang on my every word, I'm not about to dissuade them. Being Emissary is a responsibility, and it's one I take seriously as my responsibilities as a Starfleet officer. He sipped his Klingon coffee. Respectfully, it isn't the same thing as what you went through, Captain. The Bajorans don't worship me, and my being Emissary isn't due to an accidental concatenation of circumstance. I did find the Celestial Temple. I am the Emissary. Before Picard could respond to that, the comm line beeped, and Worf's voice sounded over the speakers. Defiant to Zambesi. Sisko reached for the comm line like a dying man leaping at a life preserver. Zambesi here. Go ahead, Mr. Worf. Qatar sent an automated message with the coordinates for the planet. We're forwarding it now. Looking down at the status board, Sisko saw a file was coming in on the same subspace frequency as the message. Receiving coordinates now. Captain, I do not like this. Request permission to set course for the Badlands. The Defiant should be there as a reinforcement. No, Sisko said before Worf could finish. It's too risky. Report back to the station, Commander. Aye, sir. Defiant out. Picard gave a half smile. That was Worf's I'm only following this order because I respect the chain of command voice. Sisko couldn't help but bark a laugh at that as he input the coordinates the Klingon had sent to the con. He uses that voice a lot. He always has. Right after we took the Enterprise D out, we had to separate the saucer. I gave Worf command of the saucer section while I proceeded to the battle bridge. He didn't take it well. I can imagine. Course set for Beleva. Sisko engaged the impulse engines. Worf's like a kid in the candy store with the Defiant. Not surprising. Picard's half smile became a full one. Right after that, Worf almost blasted a hole in the main viewer when Q's face appeared in it. I've met Q, I don't blame him. Yes, I heard about that. I must apologize. That confused Sisko. Why? Q... Picard hesitated. I always felt he was my responsibility, that if it weren't for me, he wouldn't be making so much trouble for Starfleet. He hasn't been around since that first time. Sisko smiled. Probably because I decked him. Sisko wished he had an imager to capture the expression on Picard's face. I beg your pardon? The other captain said incredulously. I decked him. Sisko repeated proudly. Didn't help matters any, but it felt good. I shall have to remember that. Sisko tried to imagine Picard decking Q as Sisko had. The image wouldn't take. Instead, he said, Q is hardly your responsibility, Captain. Perhaps not. Picard didn't sound very convinced to Sisko's ears. Within the hour, they were at the planet in question. Accessing the library computer, Sisko said, Beleva was used as a ship repair station by the Bajoran resistance during the Cardassian occupation. It's unused now. Nodding, Picard said, I was afraid we would be sent to a Maquis stronghold. If it is, we haven't heard about it, and I think Gowron would want to avoid the Maquis as well. The Klingons are probably better informed about the Maquis than we are, given that they've been supplying them. Picard nodded. My first officer's away mission is to track down a possible handoff between the Klingons and the Maquis. Sisko whirled on his fellow captain. Remembering the theft of the Defiant 2 years earlier, he said, Are you sure that was a good idea? Sounding somewhat defensive, Picard said, Absolutely. I understand your experiences with Thomas Riker were not pleasant, but genetics notwithstanding, my first officer is a different person. I hope so. He looked away. The Maquis have proven to be very seductive. He thought about his old friend, Cal Hudson, phasering his Starfleet uniform into oblivion. I'm quite aware, believe me, Picard said in a quiet voice. Sisko supposed that he too had lost comrades to the Maquis. The sensor alarm beeped, again saving Sisko. Klingon vessel approaching. Registers as a Defense Force shuttle pod. Sisko noted that, just as Qatar's communication contained no ID tag that specified that it was from the High Council, this vessel contained nothing to indicate that it belonged to the Chancellor. Normally, a person of Gowron's importance would travel with more pomp and circumstance, or at least what passed for such among Klingons. If this mission was truly attempting to be covert, as Azranal seemed to believe, then that made sense. But as Worf had pointed out, that could also mean that this entire thing was a trap. Sisko found himself second-guessing his refusal to let Worf bring the Defiant to the Badlands. But if this was genuine, the sight of the Defiant would likely send Gowron back to the Empire. Sisko had dealt with Gowron long enough to know that he was prickly at the best of times. "They're hailing us," Picard said, and Sisko saw that a signal was coming in, though it was a bit weak. No doubt the plasma storms were interfering with communications. Opening a channel, Sisko said, "This is the USS Zambesi." The screen next to Sisko's right lit up with the wide-eyed face of Chancellor Gowron, though there was interference around the edge of the signal. "Sisko! Picard! We meet again!" Before Sisko could speak, Picard said, "Thank you for agreeing to see us, Chancellor. I was not sure you would agree to my terms. That you did bespeaks the urgency of your mission." "I told you when your fleet attacked my station, Gowron," Sisko said. "Our remaining enemies plays right into the Founder's hands." "So you have insisted. We will land on Beleva and talk further." 2 different sensor alarms went off simultaneously. Sisko saw that a plasma storm was heading right for their position. He said, "Plasma storm approaching," just as Picard said, "Gowron, why are you arming weapons?" The world exploded a minute later. Chapter 6. Beleva, the Badlands. I am Locutus of Borg. The Borg are relentless. They take everything away, systematically, meticulously, relentlessly. Resistance is futile. Phaser fire does no good. Torpedoes do no good. Starfleet throws everything it has, and it does no good. Your life, as it has been, is over. You're helpless before their onslaught, impotent to stop them from destroying what you most hold dear. From this time forward, you will service us. JeanLuc Picard woke up screaming. A deep, reassuring voice said, "It's all right." The smell of burning conduits and plasma fire burned Picard's nostrils. A shiver passed through his body. Looking around, he saw that he was strapped into the Zambesi's co-pilot seat, but that seat was halfway back near the transporter station, which was itself a pile of smoking rubble. Looking over at the forward window, he saw only white. After a moment, he realized that it was snow. His sensor sweep of Beleva had revealed that the northern hemisphere was in the grip of a particularly brutal winter season, and apparently that was where they had landed. Or, rather, crashed. What happened? Sisko was applying a hyperspray to his own arm as he spoke. Plasma storm. It came out of nowhere, took out both ships. We crashed. But we survived. Well done, Captain. Thank you, but we're not quite out of the woods yet. The Zambesi's a complete wreck. Comm systems are down, hull integrity is too low to even consider taking off, even if the engines were online. He let out an annoyed growl. I should have known this would happen as soon as O'Brien said the Rio Grande was unavailable. What do you mean? Picard undid the straps, which he didn't remember putting on, but he remembered nothing since noticing Gowron had armed weapons, and tried to stand up. Pain sliced through his chest. Careful, Sisko said, walking over with the medikit. He cracked a couple of ribs from the straps. Picard nodded. Unnecessary evil. Had he not worn the straps, his injuries would likely have been fatal. He stood up more slowly. You delivered 3 runabouts to the station when we took over. The Rio Grande is the only one of those 3 that's still intact. I've lost track of the number that have been damaged beyond repair, crashed, or destroyed in the last 4 years. But the Rio Grande has been the little engine that could. That's why I requested it for this mission, to avoid this. Knowing that the other captain wouldn't appreciate a discourse on the dangers of superstitions, Picard started to gingerly undo his uniform jacket and said only, If I could trouble you, Captain. Of course. Sisko took out a bandage from the medikit, while Picard stripped to the waist. A bone knitter was too specialized a piece of equipment to trust to an emergency medikit. If someone untrained to use it tried, there was a very real risk of fusing body parts. Starfleet Medical thought it best to stick with bandages for emergencies until such a time as a doctor or a medtech could knit the bones. When you screamed like that, Sisko said, I was afraid you had an injury the tricorder missed. Simply a nightmare, Picard said quietly. A fairly common one these past 7 years, truth be told. Sisko said nothing. Picard knew the man could count, and could probably guess what the tenor of Picard's nightmares were. It still haunts you? Sisko finally said. Constantly. Picard's voice was ragged, and he cleared his throat. There are times when it fades, but it never goes away completely. When Sisko finished bandaging his ribs, Picard turned to face the younger man. Captain, I don't expect you to forgive me for what happened to your wife. Sisko hesitated, and Picard saw a range of emotions play across the man's face in an instant. Finally, I don't blame you. I blame the Borg. I won't lie. Seeing you is a constant reminder, and not a pleasant one. But it was the Borg that took Jennifer from me, not you, Captain. Picard let out a long breath, which made his chest hurt. I think we're past the point of ranks, don't you? If anyone's earned the right to call me JeanLuc, it's you. At that, Sisko inclined his head. And you can call me Captain Sisko. Picard felt his face fall, and only then did Sisko break into a huge smile. Or Ben. Then Picard laughed, though it hurt like blazes. Very well, Captain Sisko. Let us see if Gowron survived his encounter with the plasma storm. I'd very much like to know why he felt the need to arm his pod's weapons. Agreed, JeanLuc. It took an hour to pack up supplies from the Runabout's emergency kit. Luckily, Starfleet was thorough. There were enough combat rations to last a month, a dozen hand phasers and half a dozen phaser rifles, a shelter, and thermal jackets. According to the tricorder, Gowron's ship had crashed 4 kilometers away, but also on the other side of a mountain. It would take most of a day to get there. The pod was also sending an automated distress signal. As they put the packs on their backs, Sisko said, I have to admit, I'm not too sanguine about what kind of rescue we'd get from the Klingons. Better than no rescue at all, Picard said, and Sisko found he couldn't argue with that, especially once they left the Runabout's confines. Wind bit into Sisko's eyes, and the cold air seared his lungs as he inhaled. The snow came up to his ankles, and the effort of lifting his feet to walk proved far more difficult than he'd imagined. All of it was made worse by the pounding in his head. The hypo he'd applied was supposed to ease the discomfort of the concussion he'd suffered in the crash, but 10 seconds in this blizzard did away all the good it did. Are you all right, Ben? Sisko barely heard Picard's voice, even though he was shouting. I'm fine, he lied. Let's move. Chapter 7. Federation Starbase Deep Space Nine, Bajoran System. Worf approached the office slowly. He was not entirely sure that he was not engaging in a fool's errand. He also knew that he could probably do what he wished to do on his own authority as strategic operations officer of the station, but he respected Kira Nerys too much to do that. So he touched the door chime. It opened a moment later. Kira was leaning as far back in Sisko's chair as she could and reading over a pad. What can I do for you, Commander? I wish to summon Cadet Nog to Ops, as well as Commander Data from the Enterprise. Frowning, Kira asked, What for? Worf hesitated. To go over the communication Qatar made to the Defiant. Kira smiled. That would be the same communication you've been going over for the last day? Yes, Worf said tightly. However, Nog's hearing is far greater than that of most humanoids, and Data also has perceptions beyond what holding up a hand. Kira said, It's all right, Worf. Do it. I'm with you. This whole thing has seemed wrong from the start. Thank you, Major. Any word from the captain? Not yet. Nor is there any new information from the probe. Looking at him quizzically, Kira asked, What probe? Again, Worf hesitated. Before returning to the station from the border, I ordered the Defiant to send a Class 8 probe to the Badlands to monitor the situation. Kira smiled. Good idea. Let me know what happens with Qatar's message. Nodding, Worf went back to Ops. Chief, contact the Enterprise and ask Commander Data to beam to Ops. O'Brien smiled from his station. She said yes, huh? Worf did not dignify that with a reply, but instead tapped his comm badge. Worf to Nog. Nog here! Report to Ops immediately, Cadet. Aye, sir. Within minutes, Ferengi and Android had joined Worf, O'Brien, and Dax at the Chief's station. This, Worf said, is the communication that Qatar sent to the Defiant. He nodded to O'Brien, who began the playback. Greetings, Captain Picard, Captain Sisko. I assume this channel is secure. Sir, Nog said, do you have a recording that you know is Qatar? Worf looked at Dax, who said, we don't have any recent High Council sessions, but we've got a bunch from before the Empire pulled out of the Accords. She touched several controls on her console. A visual record also, please, Data said. Do you see something, Commander? Worf asked. Data winced, something Worf was not used to seeing from the android. He'd only had his emotion chip for a short time, and Worf hadn't served with him for hardly any of it, so an emotional Data was still an oddity to him. At the moment, it is only a hypothesis. The main viewer showed a High Council session. Qatar was standing in the center. It is my belief that Governor Torek was wholly justified in his actions, and that he should remain in his post, and that no action be taken against him or the House of Hergo, which has served the Empire honorably since the days of Chancellor Sturka. That isn't the same voice, Nog said emphatically. Sounds the same to me, Dax said. It's very close. One of the best forgeries I've ever heard. O'Brien stared at the young Ferengi. How many have you heard, kid? Data smiled, another oddity to Worf, and said, Cadet Nog is correct. There are also minute discrepancies in the visual record. Commander Dax, what is the date of that recording? Dax checked her console. Stardate 48876. While it is true, Data said, that some Klingons undergo minute changes in their cranial ridges over time, I do not believe that there is any documented case of all ridges decreasing depth by 4.2 centimeters over so small a time span as 1 year, 9 months, and 5 days. The image sent to the Defiant is based on images of Qatar, but does not have the full depth of resolution for a perfect match. So who did contact us? Someone who wished to lure both captains into a trap. Worf tapped his comm bench. Major Kira, please report to Ops. Kira came slowly out of the captain's office a moment later. What did you find? The communication from Qatar was a fake, Worf said. Nog said, but that wasn't a holofilter. It was a call from someone who disguised himself to look and sound like Qatar. It was really good, too. I believe I know the source of the technology, Data said. It is based on equipment used by a woman named Ardra, and which was used by Captain Snowden and Cadet Nomine on Starbase 375 during Admiral Layton's coup attempt. Worf put it together. The equipment stolen from Starbase 50. Yes. Looking at Kira, Worf said, we must take the Defiant to the Badlands. No, Kira said. The Enterprise should go, but I want the Defiant here. If the Klingons, or Klingon agents, or whoever is going after Captain Sisko, they may be after the station next. I don't want to leave us vulnerable. Data said, I will depart immediately. Dax's console beeped. Better make it fast, Commander, she said. The probe Worf left behind? It's picking up a Klingon bird of prey heading for the Badlands at warp 7. Understood. Data walked to the transporter platform. Energize. O'Brien sent him back to the Enterprise. Part of Worf wished he was going with them. It galled him to stay behind while two of the humans he respected most in the galaxy were in danger. But Kira was also correct. Whatever was being planned here was likely bigger than simply trapping Sisko and Picard, and the station needed to be protected. As much because he needed to do something, he looked at Dax. We should contact the High Council with this information. You really think they'll believe us? No. Worf knew firsthand how fickle the High Council was. They were the ones who were all too willing to condemn Worf's own father for aiding the Romulan attack on Khitomer in order to protect a high-ranking counselor whose father was the true traitor. However, we should inform them in any event. Dax is right, Kira said. They're not going to listen. You'd be better off talking to someone you know and trust who can relay the message to the Council. Worf and Dax stared at each other and then simultaneously said, Kor. Kira's face scrunched up. That old drunk? Dax said, Kor may be an old drunk, but he's an old drunk who's a Dahar master. It's worth a shot. Kira shrugged. Fine, track him down. Data's voice sounded over the comm line. Enterprise to Ops. Request permission to disembark. After nodding to O'Brien, Kira said, Permission granted, Enterprise. Bring them home. We will endeavor to do so, Major. Data out. It took Dax several hours to track Kor down. Once it was clear that he wasn't at any of the several homes he maintained throughout Klingon space, the house of Kor was one of the wealthier ones in the Empire, she started in on his drinking haunts. Worf's instinct was to chide Dax for going straight to taverns, but Worf knew Kor. Sure enough, the elderly Dahar master was at a tavern on Baal-Da'ar base. Curzon and Kor had shared many a drink there, apparently. Dax, my old friend, Kor said while he rubbed his eyes and recognized the person on the other end of the communication. So good to see your lovely face, my dear. Ah, and Worf, how fares the son of Moog? Poorly, at the moment. Quickly, Worf and Dax filled Kor in on what had happened. Kor frowned. Qatar. Fearing that the old warrior's memory was failing, Worf said, Qatar is a counselor, Kor. Yes, I know who he is, you young toads. I am merely trying to remember. Ah, yes, Torv. Who's Torv? Dax asked. An old comrade of mine in Imperial Intelligence. He was just telling me the other day something regarding Qatar. He waved his arms up and down. If only I could remember. It was of interest, too, because it involved a familiar name. Then he straightened, his face brightening. I remember now! Sisko! I learned of a plot to have Sisko and that human that Kempek made his arbiter, Picard, that's the one, to have them killed in Gowron's name in order to keep our nations from becoming allies again. What does that have to do with Qatar? Worf asked, wishing that Kor would get through this digression so they could have him talk to the High Council. What do you mean? Qatar is the counselor who deals with II, of course. Worf debated the efficacy of pointing out to Kor that he could not possibly have known that. Dax rescued him. Kor, we don't exactly know the intricacies of who's doing what on the High Council these days. No, yes, of course, you're right. Well, never mind, it doesn't matter. I'm sure Qatar did something about it. On the contrary, Worf said, wondering why he bothered telling Kor anything. As we just told you, the plan has been engaged. Captain Sisko and Picard have been led into a trap by someone claiming to be Qatar. That is odd. Qatar's usually more efficient than that. Kor, Dax said, we need you to inform the High Council. People are speaking in Qatar's name and Gowron's name. That's treason. Oh, indeed it is. Yes. Very well, my good friends. I will see to this at once. Thank you, Kor. We are in your debt. Nonsense! Kor said with a wave of his hand. Dax and I are comrades in blood, and Worf, we are warriors who have fought side by side. There are no debts between such as us. We will speak again when all is done. With that, Kor closed the connection. Dax looked up at Worf. You think that'll do any good? It is difficult to say, Worf said after a moment. The word of a Dahar master, especially one of Kor's accomplishments, will mean much to the High Council. I do not know if it will be sufficient to save the captains. Nodding and sighing at the same time, Dax said, Let's hope Data can beat that bird of prey there. Chapter 8. Boleva, the Badlands. Picard had always found Starfleet's thermal suits to be a marvel of textile engineering. The suits were thick, ankle-length coats, with plush lining, and elements were woven into the fabric that kept the wearer at a constant, comfortable temperature, regardless of what was happening outdoors. There was also a hat, a pair of gloves, and a pair of boot attachments, and Picard and Sisko had made use of all three. That at least was the theory. The reality was that winter on the northern hemisphere of Boleva was sufficiently intense that the thermal suit was struggling against it. As he and Sisko trudged through the now knee-high snow toward Gowron's pod signal, snow blowing in his face, Picard felt the chill in his bones. He had been hoping that the exertions of moving through the snow with the packs on their backs would be warming, but it, too, was not enough. Intellectually, he knew that, were he not wearing the suit, he would likely be dead from frostbite. But he couldn't help but think of a few choice words for the engineers who put the suits together that they weren't able to come up with something that would protect him from this. It didn't help that his cracked ribs caused a constant ache that was made infinitely worse by the cold. The plasma storms illuminated space around Boleva, but it was sufficiently diffused by the atmosphere that the world appeared to be in a constant state of twilight. Stealing a glance behind him, the pathway they were using was only wide enough for them to move single file. He saw that Sisko was moving at an even pace, and that a great deal of snow had caught in his goatee. The winds were howling loud enough for conversation to be difficult, so Picard tapped his comm badge and said, "How are you doing, Ben?" The first name sounded odd in Picard's mouth. Sisko's deep voice sounded tinny over the comm badge, and Picard could still barely hear it. A couple of years ago, O'Brien and I were on a planet that had a human colony. There was a duonetic field in place, and the people there had learned to live without technology. We were their guests for a while, until Kira and Dax rescued us, but until then, we had to live by their rules. If you broke a rule, you had to sit in the punishment box, which was this small metal box that sat out in the sun. I sat in that box for a long time. It was hot, humid, cramped, and horrible, and I'm feeling awfully nostalgic for it right now. Picard smiled. What rule did you break? O'Brien was trying to contact the Rio Grande. We thought it was still in orbit, but I'm the chief CO, so I was the one punished. Where was the runabout? Alexis, the woman who ran the colony, she set it off into the sun, or so she thought. Her aim was off, and it deflected off the sun's corona. Although he wasn't facing the other man, Picard could hear the smile in Sisko's voice when he said, "I told you the Rio Grande was blessed." Indeed. They trudged onward in silence for a bit, then Picard said, "Before the plasma storm hit, Gowron's pod armed weapons. So you said, you think he planned to fire on us? Weapons are of little use against a plasma storm. If he just raised shields, I'd understand, but I think that if we do find survivors, we have to assume they're hostile." I agree. I don't like it much, but I agree. A pause, then, "You were Gowron's Arbiter of Succession, right?" Technically, I was Kimpex. My task as Arbiter was to determine the final two candidates who would then battle to see who would be Chancellor. However, there were only two candidates, Gowron and Duras. Kimpex's true purpose in giving me the task was to find out who poisoned him. Poison? That's not very Klingon, is it? No. Which is why Kimpek tasked me with finding his murderer. We never did determine who it was, though the evidence pointed to Duras. You may believe me, Ben, that as difficult as Gowron has been, Duras would have been several orders of magnitude worse. As he spoke, Picard came around a large rock and discovered that the path had finally taken them to a part of the mountain that inclined downward. He could see a valley in front of them. A trail of smoke was rising from the valley, and Picard immediately took out his tricorder. Sisko moved to stand next to him, close enough that Picard no longer needed the comm badge to hear him. Is that what I think it is? Uh-huh. Picard nodded. The shuttle pod. The captains moved faster, in part due to now moving downhill, but most mainly because their goal was in sight. Sisko had his phaser rifle out, and after a moment Picard realized he should do likewise. It galled him to go into a situation with weapons raised. Pulling a weapon should be a last resort, not a first one, but he himself had pointed out that Gowron was about to fire on them when the plasma storm hit. It was better, under these circumstances, to be safe, especially when dealing with Klingon warriors, for whom weaponry was often the first resort among friends, much less enemies. Sisko and Picard walked abreast now, and Picard voiced his concerns. There was a time when we would not have been approaching a downed Klingon shuttlepod with phasers at the ready. There was a time, Sisko said, when there weren't founders lurking behind every tree, and when the Klingons and Federation were allies. Times, unfortunately, change. Our duty is to change it back, Picard said. Can't argue with that, Sisko said. It's why we're here. As they grew closer to the pod, it became increasingly clear that they were not going to meet any resistance. No one fired upon them, no one greeted them, nothing. Picard wasn't sure if that was a good thing or not. The pod had landed nose down in the snow, very similarly to the way the Zambesi had. A snowdrift had built up on the port side, which was another piece of evidence to support the notion that if there were survivors, they were not in any shape to fight. Which was good, as Picard was ready to collapse. The adrenaline surge he'd gotten upon sighting the pod had burned himself out pretty completely by the time they reached it. Every movement he made caused what felt like daggers through his back. Next to him, Sisko peered at his tricorder. The distress beacon is about the only thing still working on that ship. Propulsion's down, life support failing, hull integrity at only 25%. He smiled. Tactical systems are intact, however. Klingon engineers, in my experience, build such to last. Lucky us. He shook his head. I'm not picking up any life signs. Picard moved gingerly toward the pod's rear hatch, the only one of its two entrances available to them, as the side door was currently buried in snow. I shudder to think about what it would mean for the chances of peace between the Empire and the Federation if the Klingon Chancellor died ignominiously in a shuttlepod crash at the Badlands while meeting with two Starfleet captains. My money would be on it, not meaning much for those chances, Sisko said grimly. Agreed. When they reached the hatch, Picard shrugged out of his backpack and rummaged through it for a P-38. Engineers referred to them as can openers. The device loosened connections that kept doors shut, particularly when jammed or depowered. Picard just hoped it would be as effective on Klingon hatches as it tended to be on Starfleet ones. Looking over at Sisko, the younger man held his phaser rifle ready and nodded. Nodding back, Picard applied the P-38. A pneumatic hiss followed a moment later, and then the hatch rolled aside with a grinding rumble that cut through the howling of the wind. The air inside was just as cool as the air outside, confirming that life support had indeed failed. Right now, the pod's 25% integrated hull was the only thing keeping the cold out. Klingons, he knew, were more vulnerable to cold than humans. It was the only way in which the average Klingon could be considered physically weaker than the average human. Picard added that to the overwhelming evidence that said that Gowron and his compatriot were dead. It was dark inside, with the only illumination coming from a few red lights on one of the consoles, and now the open hatch. Picard activated the light atop his phaser rifle, and Sisko did likewise. At once, Picard realized that they were both right and wrong. There were no survivors on the pod, but Gowron still lived. Because the two dead bodies on the pod's deck were not the two people who contacted the Zambesi from orbit. Shining his phaser's light on the belt of one of the bodies, Picard said, "A Kutluch. Gesundheit." Picard couldn't help but smile. That's the weapon of an assassin. Remember when I said that Duras would be a worse Chancellor than Gowron? I formed that opinion in part because he sent two men very much like this one after me on Kronos 7 years ago. I was almost on the receiving end of one of those blades. So it looks like we were right, and Azaril's dismissal was premature, Sisko said. Somebody wanted the two of us to think Gowron was meeting us, so they could kill us. The question is, was it Gowron, or one of his enemies? Or one of his friends trying to help him? Picard shook his head. That question should, I think, be tabled. A rescue party being sent off to this ship may not have our best interests at heart. The comm line then crackled, and a voice spoke in the Klingon language amidst tremendous static. Garrick, this is Ngwabi. Respect. Are the humans dead? Spawned. We will. The Badlands within the hour. Ngabwi out. Picard looked at Sisko, who said, definitely not our best interests at heart. To be continued on Friday. Please have a good Thanksgiving, and please, if you're traveling, be careful. And if you're traveling, why? Stay home. It's safer. Numbers are going up. This is going to get worse before it gets better. Please stay safe. Stay home. Be with your loved ones virtually if you must, but which is what we're doing. But please be careful and please be safe. Wear your masks. Wash your hands. Stay inside. Anyway, thank you very much for watching. Please support me on Patreon at patreon.com/crad. Please read my website at DeCandido.net, my blog at decandido.wordpress.com, and come back on Friday and hear the rest of it. Take care, and as I said, please stay safe.